Much appreciate you guys. You're one of my favorite audiences. Some of you know that I've been a college professor teaching astronomy at William Jessup, and one of my ideal jobs that I was able to take after I semi-retired, and then just this last year I retired from that. So right now I am blissfully unemployed. I do enjoy the observatory. And by the way, the observatory, you don't need to wait for us to make a special thing for you guys to come up. You're welcome to come up anytime. We're open every Friday and Saturday night when it's clear, which isn't always lately. Hopefully we'll get lots of rain, but so far we haven't. Anyway, the world I circulate in is science. And one of the problems is that the world seems to think that science has supplanted God, that we no longer need God because we have science. And that's what I want to talk about today, is that conflict between God and science. And let's go to the next slide here. And here's a couple of quotes that are pretty interesting quotes. And the first part of my speech, you guys are going to say, wait a minute, where's this guy coming from? Because I'm going to kind of present it like science would, and it'll sound like I'm against God, but I'm not. You just have to wait for a little bit till we get further into it. But these are a couple quotes. This is from Richard Dawkins and another one by Sam Harris. And those are two very extreme critics of Christianity and of God. Okay? And the first one says, not only do we need no God to explain the universe and life, God stands out as the universe's most glaring example of superfluous sore thumbs. So basically saying, we don't need God to explain what's here. As a matter of fact, God gets in the way, is what he's saying. And then this other one by Sam Harris is, the success of science often comes at the expense of religious dogma. So the more we find out about science, the more it hurts our belief, is what he's saying. And then he says, the maintenance of religious dogma almost always comes at the expense of science. So those of us who believe strongly in God are the ones who are in the way of scientific progress, is what he's saying. So we don't need God to explain things, is what he's saying. Let's go to the next slide. And what happened up until 150 years or so ago, there really was no plausible explanation for why we're here and why things exist, why animals exist, why the stars in the sky exist, why the earth goes around the sun, except for God. Okay, we really did not have a way to explain any of that stuff. And then along comes a guy named Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, some of you guys know the story, made some pretty logical, cool stuff. He was a great scientist in lots of ways. He was on the ship called the Beagle, and they traveled to an island off the coast of Chile called Galapagos. And there he started studying the animals. And he came up with what we call the theory of evolution. I'm going to go more into that here in just a minute. But the thing that theory of evolution made possible is people for the first time were able to say, hey, I don't need God. I don't need God to explain what's here. And that was the beginning of this process that today has culminated in people saying, God is not only not needed, but he's in the way. Okay, and that's where we are with science versus God right now. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. We're going to come back to Darwin here in a minute, because we need to look at him a little more carefully, and I think we'll see that there's some big mistakes and things he didn't understand that make him no longer plausible. But let's talk about cosmology. Cosmology is just the study of the beginning, how we got here. Okay, and pretty much everybody today, including a lot of Christians and including me, believe in something called the Big Bang, that there was a discrete beginning to everything, and that everything after that came everything after that has come. But that discrete beginning was a beginning point. And of course, Genesis 1 says, in the beginning. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit when we talk about this. But basically, scientists have been able to, by theory, look back, and they have a pretty good explanation for how things developed from that point on. And people feel like, hey, sure, we don't understand everything, but we're beginning to understand it. We don't need God to explain it. Science can explain the cosmos, and that's what cosmology is trying to do. And so let's go to the next slide. And scientists say, hey, sure, we don't understand everything yet, but we're on the process. There's a lot of stuff that we didn't understand 10 years ago that we understand now. And presumably, 10 years from now, there'll be things we understand then that we don't understand now. So it's okay that we don't know everything, we don't have all the answers, but it looks like we're going to have the answers without having to explain them using God. Okay, and that's where it's going to come on. For example, Darwin himself was a pretty honest guy. He says, well, I think this is true, and what we need to do is go look at the fossil record, the record of all the things that have been out there that have died, and I think we're going to prove that I'm right. But if we look at that and don't find what I expect, then my theory is in big trouble. And, that's what he said. But he explained it saying, I think we're going to figure it out as time goes by. Okay, are you guys mad at me yet? You probably should be, because it sounds like I'm advocating for a world without God, because that's where the world has gone. Basically, the logic that I just explained, that no longer need God to explain why we're here. That a godless world makes sense, is what they're saying. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And the thing about scientists is science is different than a lot of things in that it's supposed to be without preconceived notions. Scientists are always supposed to be open-minded and open to new ideas. And scientists will always put their idea out there and saying, I want somebody to prove me wrong. Okay, and the idea is that they're trying to arrive at the truth by a process that we call science, the scientific method, and I present my evidence to you. You look at it really closely, and you do a process called peer review. And peer review is before anything in science can be published, it has to go out to the scientific community, and everybody looks at it, and Mike looks at it and he says, oops, Randy, you made a mistake here, and it doesn't go out. Or maybe 5 other people look at it and come back with me and present a contrarian view, and we revise it, and ultimately we're getting closer and closer to the truth all the time. And that's what peer review is supposed to do, and that's what is there. But in truth, science doesn't always work that way. Sometimes scientists get preconceived ideas and they say, this is the way it is, and they refuse to even listen to the other side. And I think that's where science has gotten to today, to a large extent. Scientists are not neutral anymore. That scientists, in lots of ways, for example, in the whole area of cosmology, in the whole area of physics, in the whole area of biology, and evolutionary biology in particular, refuse to even listen to other ideas. And some examples of that is if you were, or for example, if I, and I've actually tried this, tried to apply for a job in a public university where I was teaching biology, one of the questions they would ask me is, do you believe in evolution? And if I said no, I would not be hired. I would not even be considered, even if I was the most qualified person. Or for example, scientific journals would never publish anything from some of the people I'm going to be quoting here in a little bit, because they don't want to look at that. Now, that's not what science is supposed to be, but to a large extent, that is what it has become. And and then the other thing is, a lot of times they use terms to describe, for example, the term creationist has a very negative connotation among scientists. If you were to say, oh, he's a creationist, that would be similar to me saying he believes in a flat earth, or he's a voodoo doctor. You know, that it's implying that you're not a scientific person, that you don't believe in science, but to imply that. Okay, so let's look at, this is a cool quote. It says, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but we can't criticize the government. In the United States, we can criticize the government, but we can't criticize Darwin. So if you were to be a Darwin critic, you would immediately be relegated to, or you'd be what we call canceled. You guys know what canceled is? We live in a society where there's something called cancel culture. So for example, if you have certain beliefs, they just try to kick you out. And there have been some very famous examples of actors and actresses that don't get to play parts anymore because they believe certain things. And recently, people have been canceled because of what they believe about vaccinations for COVID, for example. If you believe that the vaccinations are a bad idea, they'll cancel you. You don't even get to speak in public. You don't get to be an actor or an actress. Well, if you are against evolution in our society, you are canceled in lots of places. It's like you do not exist. You're not allowed to have an opinion. So unfortunately, that's where we are as a country. Okay, let's go to the next one. And so let's go back to Darwin again. We're going to talk a little bit about what Darwin did. And the interesting thing is, Darwin made a conclusion, and it was a pretty good one. He went to this island that is something like 1,500 miles off the coast of Chile, and he started looking at the animals there, and he says, these animals are really similar, but they're not exactly the same. And specifically, he looked at 10 different kinds of a bird called a finch. And he saw those 10 different kinds, and he said, they're all different, but they're really similar. Isn't it strange that 10 varieties of this bird came to this island? And after he started looking elsewhere, he found out that those 10 varieties didn't exist anywhere else in the world. So how on earth did this one little island get 10 varieties of finches? And he came to a conclusion, which I think is a good one, and that is that probably it started out as one variety of finch, and that those finches started specializing. This one went after insects, and this one went after seeds, and this one went after fruit. And they developed different beaks, and I think this is the next slide here. And he came to this conclusion that each of these were specialized based on what they ate, which is called a niche. So these are the 10 different varieties he saw, and he says, what caused them to differentiate? Why is this one different than that one? And if they all started out the same, how did they change? And that was the beginning of his thought on evolution, or part of that, was trying to understand that change that happened. And basically he said, what happened is, over time, these things adapted to their environment. And he came up with a term called survival of the fittest. So for example, if, say, this is the original one here, if that was the only one, they would compete against each other and they wouldn't have enough to eat, and a lot of them wouldn't survive. So some of them became that, and they found a whole new bunch of stuff to eat that nobody was eating, and they were able to survive. And ultimately, over time, they differentiated and became where they could survive. And he described survival of the fittest as being the ability to reproduce. If you can have children and pass on your traits to your children, you're successful. If you're not successful. And that was the beginning of Darwin's thought. Let's go to the next slide. And the other thing he noticed is, and this is kind of a small slide, I apologize for that, but he says, when you look at these vertebrates are just animals that have backbones. We're vertebrates. He says, they all have some things in common. They all have the backbone. They all have the head at the front. They all have 4 appendages. In the case of birds, they have 2 wings and 2 feet. In the case of fish, they have pectoral fins and ventral fins. And mammals, of course, have the 4 feet. Even snakes, if you dissect them, have bones where legs would be. And he says, well, how do you explain that? Well, the answer is that they all came from a common ancestor. And that was his explanation for that. And so let's go to the next slide. And he also said, I haven't seen this in the fossil record, but I bet it's true. If we look back at the fossil record, we're going to see transitionary species. So, for example, if birds evolved from reptiles, that we would see intermediates in between that. We'd see reptiles with feathers, and then eventually reptiles with wings, and eventually reptiles that could fly, and eventually they would be birds. And we'd find all of these transitionary species between the original one. And he believed that that was true, and there were also species that they thought were transitionary that had existed. And so he expected to see that. And when you look back at the fossil record, there really are a lot of things back there that we don't have around today. Matter of fact, 3/4 of all the animals that have ever existed on Earth are extinct. We've only got about 1/4 of them left. And so when you look back at those, you do find a variety of stuff. And that was one of his conclusions, or one of the things he thought would be true. Let's go to the next slide. And he also was able to, in the fossil record, find things like horses of different sizes. And he says, well, this is the evolution of the horse from that to that. And that this is the evolution of a whale from a land species through the whale. And he was able to do that by comparing their anatomy and comparing things about them to make those conclusions. This is the evolution of a bat, and we'll actually talk about that later, because that's a very good example of why evolution doesn't work. So anyway, those are the conclusions that he made. And let's go to the next slide. And there were some things that he didn't understand that are really important that we understand today. And one of those is DNA. He did not understand DNA. What's DNA? DNA is the programming that's built into our bodies. Every cell of your body has a cell, and that cell has a chemical in it called DNA that has an encoding of all the things that makes my hair recede and makes me 6 feet tall and makes me tend to be wide at the belly and probably will various things that make me me and make you you are encoded in your DNA. And that DNA is very, very complex. Let's go to the next slide. And there's about 6.4 billion pairs of information that encode who you are. Okay, and a good example of that is I left my cell phone back there, but what's valuable about the cell phone? Is it the hardware? No, it's the programming that makes it do what it does, okay? It's the fact that it has all this knowledge available to you. What's valuable about a book? It has like a pound of paper and some ink. That's not very valuable, but the information contained in the book is what's valuable. And it's the information contained in the human that makes us valuable too. And that is what is the cause for change in people. Let's go back a couple of slides to the one called Lamarckism. Okay, there we go. And this is what Darwin thought things were. Lamarckism says if you do something repeatedly, you're going to pass that on to your children. Okay, so for example, all of you know who our former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was. What do you think his kids look like? Are they big, muscular people? No, they're not, because they don't work out. And you don't pass something on to your kids just because you're good at it. You pass something on to your kids because it's in your DNA, right? He thought that animals like giraffes that stretch to get the food on top, eventually their children have longer necks. And they stretch, and then their children have longer necks, and they stretch, and their children have longer necks, and they stretch, and eventually you have a giraffe. And that was the belief as to what caused things to change over time. As animals specialize doing specific things, they pass those traits on to their children. Okay, now we know that's not true. We know that the thing that causes us to be who we are and the traits we pass on to our children are based on our DNA, right? And actually the DNA of our mate. And those two combine and we pass on certain traits. And luckily most of my kids got most of my wife's traits. But anyway, it's our DNA that makes things happen. So he had a pretty big misunderstanding about that. Since that time, now that we understand what DNA is and what it does, a new mechanism has come to belief as to what causes the change that causes things to change from one species to a little mother to another to another to another, and that's called mutations. And if you think about it, I used to program computers. I wrote a program that was used by hospitals for their billing systems. And if even you were to go in there and randomly change a couple of characters in the programming, the program wouldn't work anymore. It didn't take much, even one character change could cause the program to mess up. But conceivably, 1 out of 1,000,000 changes you could make could actually make it better. I've never encountered that in my programming, but usually my mistakes cause it to fail. And that's the truth in mutations for humans too, or for animals. How many mutations you guys know? Have you heard of Down syndrome, trisomy 18, things like that are genetic diseases caused by mutated genes in humans. Okay, very seldom do they make things better. I can think of one example of where arguably they may have made things better. If you were a person living in Africa and you developed something called sickle cell anemia, some of you may have heard of that, that would make you more or less likely to succumb to malaria. So that's one example of perhaps a positive mutation. So anyway, evolutionists now say that what's happened is over time, these random mutations happen to creatures, and every once in a while, one of those is good. And if it's good, it helps them to thrive, and they are able to reproduce and pass that gene on to their children. And ultimately, you pass enough of those genes on, and you develop a better creature or a different creature than you started out with. And that's where scientists have come to today to explain evolution. It's still survival of the fittest, but the way things change is based on mutations in your DNA. So that's a very different than what Darwin thought originally. And we can actually see that in some situations. This situation right here is a good example of that. These two moths are called pepper moths, and pepper moths traditionally were white. And then the Industrial Revolution, these were in England is where these occurred. The Industrial Revolution came along, they burned a lot of coal. What happened to all the trees? They turned black. Okay, guess what? Being white was not a very good thing if you're a moth, right? And it would mean that you're very likely to get caught. And so within a few years, all the moths, or not all the moths, but most of the moths turned black. Now, was that an advantage for them? Yeah, it was an advantage for them. And they were able to survive. Is that proof that evolution happens? Okay, well, let me tell you what happened more recently. England stopped using coal. They don't use coal in England anymore. Guess what color the moths are now? They're white again. Whoa. So evolution in a nutshell right there, proof that it happens, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out that there were always white moths and there were always black moths. It's just they were in smaller numbers. When they originally, when most of the moths were white, there were still a few black ones around. And the black ones really didn't have an advantage, but they survived anyway. And then when the coal came along and everything turned black, the white ones were now at a disadvantage. And so they got eaten up and the black ones were able to reproduce. Now that the coal isn't around anymore, the black ones no longer have an advantage and the white ones do, and the white ones have come back. So again, it's not evolution that's happening, it's just natural variation within the species that's happening there. Another example is COVID vaccine. Okay? Think about COVID just in the last couple of years. What's happened to the COVID virus? Started out with one variety, and then it changed to another variety, and then it changed to another variety, and we see the COVID strain changing over time. Is that evolution? Well, yeah, arguably it is. It's a type of microevolution. Once we learned how to combat one of them, the other one was able to take over and keep going. And that'll probably go on forever. We're probably stuck with COVID for the rest of our lives. And it'll be like the flu vaccine that we take every year. And that's because it has this ability to change. And another example of that is bacteria. Originally, penicillin was created, and what does penicillin do? It kills bacteria, right? Well, that's a good thing, but at some point, penicillin stopped working. Okay, if you go in with an infection now, they don't give you penicillin. Why not? Because there's a pretty good chance it won't work. The bacteria out there has become immune to penicillin. And so they try another different antibiotic. And eventually, even now, it's getting that there are some infections that are really hard to control with any antibiotic because the bacteria are developing an immunity to those antibiotics. Okay, now, is that true? Are they evolving? Is the bacteria evolving? Well, to some extent it is, but in truth, what's happening is a few of those bacteria, even back at the beginning, were not subject to or were not able to controlled by penicillin. Well, what happened is the penicillin came along and killed all the other ones. What was left? The ones that were immune, and those started reproducing. Well, pretty soon we tried to kill those with penicillin, and they said, guess what? My mommy and daddy weren't, you couldn't kill them, and you can't kill me either. And so over time, the natural variability within a species can come out. And another example is dogs. How many dogs do you think God created? Do you think he created 175 different varieties of dogs? He probably didn't. But over years, we have bred dogs so that some of them are really big, and some of them are really tiny, and some of them are really yappy, and some of them are really calm, and all kinds of dogs. Probably that's just due to the natural variability, not to an evolution of dogs, okay, is what happened. Okay, so let's go on. And So this is just saying that mutations occur, some actually improve the organism, and they believe that improved organisms are more likely to survive and pass things on to their children. Okay, go to the next one. But the reality is that almost all mutations are negative, and minor mutations can modify an organism slightly, but not from one species to another or one type to another. And most changes that would benefit an organism in any substantial way would require multiple simultaneous positive mutations. Let me read that again. That's a long sentence, but it's really important. Most changes that would benefit a species in any substantial way isn't just one little modification. It would require multiple modifications. So remember we showed the bat up there a little while ago? Supposedly bats came from little rodents like mice. And eventually they developed wings and they developed feet, and they already had feet. They developed wings and the ability to fly. They had hollow bones so that they were a lighter structure and all of those things, and then they became a bat. Well, how many steps does it take to go from a mouse to a bat? Not one. It takes a whole bunch of them. And which of those would benefit them? Let's say a mouse was born with wings instead of feet. Would that mouse survive? Probably not. Okay, he would go, and the cat would go, that was nice. And it would require all of those things to happen at the same time for that mouse to become a bat. And the example here, let's go to the next slide, is a mouse trap. And we as Christians have put forth an idea called irreducible complexity. And that is, you can't take each of these things separately and make a change that would benefit the organism. It requires a whole bunch of them to happen at the same time. And think about a mouse trap. How useful is a mouse trap if the spring is missing? Not very useful. How useful is it if the bail is missing, that thing, or the base is missing? All those pieces have to be there, and they all have to be working in the same generation for that mousetrap to be useful. And let's go to the next one. And here's an example of a complex organism that would have required multiple, dozens of positive mutations to happen at the same time in order for it to exist. And if all those things didn't happen at the same time, it would be a disadvantage for the organization or organism, not an advantage. And these are called biological motors, and this is called a bacterial flagellum. See that little...
Point at the other screen.
Yeah, I get to point at that screen. Sorry about that. See the little hair coming out the back? That's called a flagellum, and it spins really fast. It's like a propeller, and it moves that bacteria through the water, which allows it to avoid its predators and allows it to eat and all the nice things that it needs. Well, inside it has equivalent of an outboard motor or a motor inside that actually takes chemicals, uses those chemicals to produce energy, and that energy spins that thing very, very quickly. Well, the flagellum by itself would be useless. The motor by itself would be useless. The different parts of the motor, and here are some of the ones where it's broken down into the parts, would be useless if they weren't all there in the same generation. Okay, so let's say that, let's be really optimistic. Let's say 1 out of 1,000 mutations helps the organism. Okay, and that's probably totally exaggerating. It's probably more like 1 out of 10 million that actually help the organism. But if 1 out of 1,000 is positive, what are the chances are that 5 positive mutations would happen in the same generation? Almost impossible. Okay, and that's what our irreducible complexity argues. It says, in that generation, these things cannot happen all at the same time. And the only explanation for that is God, that there is a creator, somebody who's orchestrating those changes or orchestrating those things happening in the organism. Okay, let's talk about physics for just a minute, because I promised I would. And one of the interesting things about physics is that it conforms to mathematical rules. Okay, and the fact that we have electricity, that we have buildings that don't fall on us, that we have cars that work, is all because everything in nature is perfectly ordered and conforms to mathematics, to numbers. It doesn't have to be that way. Okay, how do you explain the fact that it is? Again, the explanation that we have is that there's a creator who made it that way, but it didn't have to be that way. Okay, next slide. And there's a term here called an anthropic principle, and that just says when we look at the world, it looks like everything was made for our benefit. Okay, all the rules of nature, the amount of water here on Earth, the fact that plants grow in certain ways, and that the temperature, our distance from the sun, all of those factors seem to be for our benefit. And again, that doesn't have to be true, but it turns out that it is. And it turns out that there are some specific physics laws or physics forces that govern how material or how atoms work and molecules work and how they combine and how they make up things are. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And we call this fine tuning. And this is a neat quote. This is by Stephen Hawking. Some of you guys know who Stephen Hawking was. He was the scientist that had MS, or no, ALS, amnios, whatever, lateral sclerosis, amniocentesis lateral sclerosis. And he died several years ago, but he was a brilliant man. And he says, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to be very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. And how do you explain that everything in our universe is so perfect? Go to the next slide. And these are the 4 fundamental forces that govern how molecules work. And we're all made out of molecules, or atoms work. And I'm not going to define them, but if each one of these were not the precise values that they are, we wouldn't be able to exist. Okay? If they were off even by 1,000th of what they are, it would not work. Okay? And so the Anthropic Principle says, how do you explain that? How do you explain that these values are so perfectly aligned and so perfectly set up for us to exist? And that's what we argue as Christians, is the only way that they possibly could is if someone was orchestrating those values, if they were exactly the right numbers. And of course we believe that that's our God who did that, who created things the way they are. Okay, so let's go on. And I want to talk about astronomy just very, very briefly. Last time I was here, we talked about the Big Bang as being a beginning of everything, and how Christians tend to have less of a problem with the Big Bang than non-Christians do, because we have an explanation for what caused that to happen. And everybody believes science is based on something called cause and effect. That if you see something has happened, there has to be something that caused that to happen. Things don't happen just randomly. Things happen because something caused them to happen. And one of the problems that scientists have is they look back at the Big Bang and they say, okay, we can explain what happened 1.000001 second after the Big Bang, and we can explain what happened a second later, and a million years later, and a billion years later, but we can't explain what happened to cause the Big Bang in the first place, or what was there before it. We have no explanation for that. And scientists don't have an explanation for that today. And so that's one of the big holes in science, or in astronomy, is that inability to explain a beginning. As Christians, we say hey, God is outside of our creation, and he created, or he chose to create things, to get things started at that point. So we have a cause, and that cause is God. And we believe God was eternal. So he didn't need a cause because he's always been here. That's kind of a tough concept for me, but I believe it's true. Okay, I just want to show you some pretty pictures here at the end, because one of my hobbies is taking photos of the stars in the sky. And last time when I was here, we talked about, and is there any way we can lower the lights? Is that possible? Okay. Last time I was here, I talked about the awe that is inherent when you look at the night sky and being able to see God in creation. And these are, at Christmas time or at New Year's time, we went to Anza Borrego Desert in Southern California and took a group of pictures. And I just want to show you a few of these. This is called the Seven Sisters, and it's also called the Pleiades. If any of you guys drive a Subaru, that's the constellation that's on the back plate of your car. And that's a group of stars that it's a star-forming region. New stars are being formed there. And you can see the gas that is forming those new stars. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is our closest neighbor. That's our closest neighborhood galaxy. It's called the Andromeda Galaxy. Andromeda Galaxy is about twice as big as our galaxy, probably 1 trillion stars. That's one with 12 zeros behind its stars in that. Pretty impressive galaxy. And that's actually on a collision course with our galaxy, and they think about 3 billion years from now, the two will collide. So you guys need to get working on your galaxy shelter in case any of you expect to be here 3 billion years from now. I expect to be somewhere else by then. Okay, next. Okay, this one is interesting because this is an object that the Chinese saw in the year 1054. Am I in your way? I'll get way over here. How's that? Sorry. They saw a supernova in the middle of the day. In the middle of the day, they could see a light shining in the sky. And once we got big telescopes, somebody started reading the Chinese and they said, hey, they said they saw something at this position. And we pointed our telescope at that spot, and this is what we saw. And that was a supernova remnant that's just a little over 1,000 years old, or a little less than 1,000 years old. And so it's still expanding. It's still really young, and we can see it actively working. It's called the Crab Nebula. Okay, next. And that's called the Eagle Nebula. You can kind of see an eagle shape there if you've got a good imagination. Okay, next. Okay, that one is called the Heart Nebula, and kind of hard to see, but there's a heart shape right there. And next, okay, that's called the Orion Nebula, and that's one of the ones that's actually visible to your naked eye, which is kind of cool. It doesn't look like that to your naked eye, but it's still pretty cool. Okay, next. Okay, that one is, what is that one? I'm not sure what that one is. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Okay, this is called the Christmas Tree Nebula. And these are all pictures that I took with my own scope. And what's cool is that God gave us those things, but we haven't been able to discover them until just recently. Next one. Okay, that's called the Rosette Nebula. And this again, this is 130 light years across. Okay, to give you an idea, our closest star is 3 light years across. And physically, that is the size of 5 full moons in our sky. It fills that big a space. So it's a great big diffuse area. This is one called the Horsehead, and you doesn't see it really clearly here, but there's a horse's head shape here, and the Flame Nebula is there. And that's part of the Orion constellation. Okay, so next. And that is a galaxy called the Triangulum Galaxy. It's one of our local neighbors, one of our second closest neighbor besides Andromeda. Let's go to the next one. and that one is called M101, the Whirlpool Galaxy. Okay, next. And this one is M51, which is a galaxy being pulled into another galaxy. Pretty amazing. And God knows those stars by name, which is pretty cool. Okay, one more. And that is another one called the Sunflower Galaxy. Okay, and I think we're almost at the end. Let's go to the next one. That's Andromeda again. I think that's the last one. Is that the last one?
Yes.
Okay, good. So anyway, sorry guys if I got a little technical, but the point is that in spite of science thinking that as time goes on, we're getting away from the need for God to explain what happens, science actually is pointing towards God. The whole irreducible complexity argument is a powerful argument. The fine-tuning argument is a powerful argument, saying God made everything precisely, and you can't explain that by chance. Okay, the whole idea that there was a discrete beginning to things with a first cause is a very powerful argument, and that we as Christians don't need to be ashamed to believe in science, but also at the same time to believe in God. And we ultimately believe that the more we know about science, the more it will reveal who God is and his power and his strength. So that's it.